Section 1.7 is about the midpoint and finding the distance in a coordinate plane. So the first thing is, on a number line, if I want to find the midpoint, it's just the average or the mean of those coordinates. So that means if my endpoints are at A and B, I would just add those numbers and divide by 2. If it's in a coordinate plane, then I'm still going to find the average, but I'm doing an average of the x coordinates and an average of the y coordinates. So for example, over here is my line. The coordinates of A and the coordinates of B is what I'd be using as my 2 points. I would add the x's and divide by 2. Then I would add the y's and divide by 2. Let's see what that looks like in terms of numbers. Here's my first problem. I have AB has endpoints at -4 and +9. It wants me to find the midpoint. So remember, you're just finding the average. So I add -4 and 9 and divide it by 2. So -4 plus 9 is 5. Dividing it by 2 means my midpoint would be at 2.5. So if you were to look here, it makes sense that here would be my midpoint. Now let's look like what it would look like on a coordinate plane. Here are my coordinates, 7, 5, and 2 and -4. Here's a visual if you needed to look at something. It wants me to find the midpoint of that segment. So I would need to add my x's. So remember, your x's come first, your y's come second, just like in the alphabet. So for my x's, I would add 7 and 2 and divide it by 2. For my y's, I would add 5 and -4 and divide by 2. So doing my math, I would get 9 divided by 2, 1 divided by 2, and then I would just divide. So I would get 4.5 and then 1/2 for the y coordinate. Pause the video and now try this on your own. So in the got it question, the first one has endpoints at -12 and 4. You should have found a midpoint at -4, because remind you that -12 plus 4 is -8. -8 divided by 2 is how you get that -4. Then for the last one, finding the midpoint, you should be adding your x's, so 5 plus 3, dividing it by 2. So that would give me 8/2. And then I should be adding my y's, so -10 and 6, so that would be -4/2. And then I would end up dividing them. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, -4 divided by 2 is -2. Alright, midpoint's pretty easy, just finding the average. Now, we're going to apply that to find a missing endpoint. So here, problem number 2, says the midpoint is at -2, 1, and one endpoint is at -5, 7. What's the coordinates of the other endpoint? So we are going to be using the midpoint formula in order to find that endpoint. So remember, I'm adding my x's and dividing by 2, and I'm adding my y's and dividing by 2. So what I've done here is, this is an example of how you would find the x's. My x coordinate right now I know is -5, so I plugged that in the x1 spot. I don't know the other x, so I'm going to leave it as just x. So all I've done for this left-hand side is plug in -5 here. Then I know the x coordinate of my midpoint, which is why I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to -2. I also have to do the y's. The y coordinate was 7, so I plugged in 7 for y1 and left everything else the same. I also know my midpoint is at 1, so that's why I set it equal to 1. So you're going to have two equations you're going to have to solve to find the x and y coordinate of your endpoint. So now I'm just going to solve. So remember, this means divide. So my first step on both sides would be multiplying by 2. So I multiplied by 2, and this became -4. On this side it disappeared. I multiplied this side by 2, and then this disappeared, and this became 2. Now I can add 5 over and subtract 7. So the x coordinate would be 1, and my y coordinate would be -5. Pause the video and see if you can do the got it question. So in the got it question, same deal, gives me a midpoint, gives me one endpoint. I need to find the coordinates of the other endpoint. So you should be setting up your equations just like this. So for the x's, it should be negative 3 plus x divided by 2 equaling the x coordinate of the midpoint. Then for the y equation, it should say negative 5 plus y divided by 2 equaling the negative 9 from the y coordinate of the midpoint. Now we're going to solve. So I multiply by 2, multiply by 2. So now I have negative 3 plus x equaling 8 for the x equation, and negative 5 plus y equals negative 18 for the y equation. I'm going to add 3 on the x equation and get 11. I'm going to add 5 on the y equation and get negative 13. So the coordinates of my end point is 11, negative 13. Now those can be kind of tricky just because they're working backwards, so you want to make sure that you're setting those up correctly. Alright, now finding the distance. Here's where you're going to use the distance formula. Here's the distance formula. It says you're going to subtract your x's, square it, subtract your y's, square it, find that sum, and then do the square root. So you want to make sure you have a calculator handy to do that square root part. So here are my 2 points. If I were going to plug stuff in, this is what it would look like. So remember, it always goes xy, xy, and then since this is your first point, you can label it with 1s. This is your second point, so you can go ahead and label it with 2s. Now I'm going to plug stuff in to my formula right where they need to go. So I plugged 4 in for x sub 2, negative 7 in for x sub 1, and it's okay that you switch them around like I did. You can also do 5 in for y sub 1 and then negative 3 in for the y sub 2. And again, I switched them around because I just go in the same order. You can go in any order as long as you keep your y's together and you keep your x's together. So now I compute correctly. Negative 7 minus 4 is negative 11. 5 minus negative 3 is 8. Next order of operation would be squaring those. So I would get 121 and 64. Next operation would be adding. So I would have the square root of 185. And then last I would do the square root, round to the nearest tenth. So that means I'm going to round this to 13.6. Alright, go ahead and pause the video and try the got it question. So in the got it question, you have 2 endpoints, negative 214 and the 3, negative 1. Watch how you set it up. You should have it set up just like this. Then when you subtracted them, you should have gotten a negative 5 here and a 15 there. Then you're going to square each of those, so you get positive 25 and positive 225. Make sure you're always getting positives. So if you're typing this into your calculator, you do have to put those parentheses around just like that in order for it to become positive. And then last, you're going to add those and then do the square root. When I do the square root of 250, I get this. Now just as a reminder, if this number behind the 10th spot is less than 5, this will stay. If it's 5 or higher, I'm going to round this up. So that's why it stays as 15.8. Alright, that's all you have for distance formula and midpoint formula. Let me know if you have questions.